you. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. Before I start, I'd like to personally acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I think this is always important, but especially so in any talk on the environment, because there really is so much that we can all learn from Indigenous Australians about environmental stewardship. Following that, I thought I might just very briefly explain how I became interested in this issue, because I guess at first glance, environmental sustainability is a little bit removed from kidney health and disease. So I've always been interested in environmental issues to some degree, but I was never particularly well informed or engaged until I finished my PhD probably 5 or 6 years ago now. And all of a sudden I had more time on my hands and I started reading more broadly about environmental issues. It actually started with me reading, for some reason, about the issues surrounding meat consumption, but I very quickly learnt about the broader issues with our food system, about pesticide use and ocean dead zones, overfishing, and then I kind of leapfrogged to learning about deforestation and plastic pollution, and then about climate change. And all of this was over a relatively well-defined period of time, and I actually became very overwhelmed and really quite depressed by the extent of these problems. So this is a photo of my youngest son in the Otway Ranges, which is one of my favourite places in Victoria where I live. But it could really be a photo of any number of people and places and things that I personally care about. And the reason for showing it is that I came to realise over this period that every one of those things would be impacted by, the choices we make and the actions we take today to address some of these environmental issues. So I started thinking at that time quite hard about what I could do with the skill set that I had from within nephrology to sort of make a contribution to these sort of issues. And I actually didn't have to think for very long, because it sounds very obvious to say, but what I realised is that human health is absolutely fundamentally dependent on a healthy planet. We need clean air to breathe, we need clean water, we need a stable climate. And so I think there's a really important role that health professionals and patients need to play in conversations about environmental issues. The other thing I realised was that the provision of renal care, particularly dialysis, has a disproportionately high environmental impact among medical therapies. And even more importantly than that, it doesn't need to be that way. There are much smarter and better ways of doing things. So since then I've spent a fair bit of my time looking at these sort of two things, really environmental advocacy generally for the sake of protecting human health, and also what we can do as a nephrology community to improve the way we deliver care. So with that being said, over the next 15 minutes or so, I'll talk a bit about the environmental impact of renal care, what we can do about it, what's happening in Australia and New Zealand at the moment in this space, and also, if I've got time, just two specific projects that I think are interesting and didn't really fit into the rest of the talk. So to start, it will probably be no news to anyone here that there are a large number of patients in Australia that are needing treatment for end-stage kidney disease. Probably even more concerningly, there are 1.7 million Australian adults with indicators of chronic kidney disease, and what this tells us is that the burden of kidney disease is likely to increase over time. Dialysis particularly is a therapy, as all of you would know, that is delivered very regularly and over a long period of time, usually years. And because of that, the recurrent per person resource consumption profile of dialysis is absolutely second to none in healthcare. Particularly with haemodialysis, we have a problem. The power requirement of the machines is absolutely huge. So over the course of a week, a standard dialysis machine would use half as much power as the average Australian 4-person home. The machines also require a lot of water, in the order of 500 litres per treatment. And to put that in context, the average Australian would use about 160 litres for all their washing, cooking, cleaning, etc. Even more importantly, we take water from the tap and then we purify it so that it's safe to go into the bloodstream. So it's highly pure, high quality water. But 2/3 of the water we pull from the tap, we actually put down the drain and don't put it to any particular use. We also generate a lot of waste in dialysis. So the estimates are that most haemodialysis machines and consumable packages generate about 2.5 kilos of plastic waste per treatment. PD generates less per treatment, but because it's a daily therapy, over the course of a year, there's even more waste generated. If we look at the number of patients on dialysis, what we think is that we probably generate about 5,000 tonnes of plastic per year. And if we look at the world dialysis population, that's probably closer to 1 million tonnes. this is all really expensive. So if you are using that much power and water and single-use consumables, it costs a lot. Over time, as more and more people are going to need dialysis, those costs are potentially going to become unsustainable. The other point is that obviously the total environmental price is also very high. So some carbon footprinting studies that look really at the overall environmental impact show that a haemodialysis patient has a carbon footprint that's about 1.5 times that of the average Australian. And the really important point there is that it doesn't need to be this way. So it's probably the best example of the kind of benefits that we can see from addressing this issue come from the UK. So back in 2009 in the UK, a green nephrology network was set up, and this was comprised of clinicians, doctors, nurses, renal technicians, patients, their families and carers, and also industry groups. And all together they worked to drive really significant practice change. So they did things like implement widespread water recycling from dialysis, really advanced recycling systems for waste, telemedicine to reduce travel-related emissions. But they also did things like drive environmentally focused research. They put out national green guidelines, and they collected representatives from dialysis units all over the country to drive change from within their own unit. And what they have shown is that they save now in the order of about 470 million litres of water from these combined initiatives, a huge amount of greenhouse gases and a lot of money at the same time. And I think really importantly, what they've also shown is that this has all led to more efficient care and at times even better care than patients were getting before. And there's been a really strong reporting of increased patient and staff morale and sense of empowerment within units. And that's because it's been something that people within dialysis units have worked on collectively together, which generally is a really positive experience. So in terms of what we can do specifically, starting first with power, what we really need to do is to move away from polluting sources of energy such as coal towards renewable sources such as solar and wind. And to some extent we need our government to drive this sort of transformation for us. But there are things that we can do at a local level. And this is an example from Geelong, which is a regional area in Victoria, and the renal unit there has done fantastic things in this space, including installing solar panels on the roof of their 4-chair home dialysis unit. And they installed a sufficient size system that the panels actually offset pretty much all of the power usage of the dialysis machines. These panels were bought at a time when panels were really expensive, but even so they paid off the panels and they've made yearly savings after that. The situation is incredibly different now because the cost of solar panels has come down so far. So this is really something that should be considered by any new build, particularly smaller units, where there is the ability to offset all of the usage. The Geelong unit also supported a number of home patients to put panels on their own roofs, and again they put size systems on the roofs that were able to offset pretty much all of their power usage, which is obviously really beneficial environmentally but also for patients. You know, in some states there are subsidies to support the electricity costs, but in many these are not sufficient. The amount of money given is not sufficient. In terms of water, so I made the point that we purify a whole lot of water. It really is crazy to pay for water to purify it and then throw 2/3 of it down the drain, and that's particularly the case given that it's really simple to reuse it. You need a tank to collect the water, you need a pump to pump it along a pipe, and that pipe has to go to something useful. In Australia at the moment we can't, despite the fact that it is high quality, drinking quality water, we can't use it for drinking, but we can use it for cleaning, we can use it to feed livestock, to flush toilets, to water gardens. This really should be incorporated, this sort of water saving infrastructure, into any new build. There's a study or a report that's come out of the UK that showed that a unit that did this recouped the costs associated with that in just a couple of months, and then saved in the order of about 10,000 Great Britain pounds every year after that. This is not compulsory in Australia. You can build a new unit without giving any attention to what you do with water recycling. There are also reports showing that retrofitting old buildings is also financially viable and even profitable, but that will depend on how difficult it is to get the pipework, etc., into the new build, and so you need a much more careful cost-benefit analysis in that sort of situation. So waste, you know, what we really need here is for the companies that supply our dialysis products to start thinking really hard about the kind of packaging that they use. You know, we need our fluids to come in packaging that can either be recycled or will break down at the end of life. But while we're waiting for that to happen, there's a fair bit that we can do at the level of the dialysis unit, and really that all comes down to how we segregate waste. So there are three main types of waste in hospitals. There's general waste that goes to landfill, there's recycling, and then there's clinical waste, and that's any waste that's potentially infected, so such as dialysis lines that have had blood going through them. Clinical waste has to be either burnt or chemically sterilised before it's thrown away, and that process is incredibly environmentally damaging but also incredibly expensive. This is a really great study that came out of Italy, and this, what they did in this study was they simulated 4 different waste policies. One was where staff did everything properly, put everything in the right bins, all the way down to what they called a careless optimal waste management policy, which is where staff just put things in whatever bin was closest, which was actually what they were doing at the time. What they found was that to go from that really careless approach to being really careful and doing things properly took about 1 minute extra of nurses' time each dialysis run, or 2 minutes for hemodiafiltration. But the cost savings associated with that were really quite large, and they extrapolated out to imagine that all the dialysis units in Italy did best practice waste management, and found that you could save about $60 million per year. If all the world dialysis units did it, we could probably save about $4 billion per year by a minute of nursing time. Just a more local example, I work at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and we've got quite a large in-centre unit. Coburg is one of our satellite units, also a large unit. At Coburg we have a fantastic nurse unit manager and a really engaged staff base and patient population who have all got involved in waste management. So one of our registrars thought he would compare what happened with waste at Coburg versus our in-centre unit, where not much attention is paid to it. What he found is that nearly double the amount of waste was generated per treatment at Royal Melbourne, and that's because the staff there didn't tend to drain fluids out of all the excess saline, for example, out of bags before throwing them in the bin. There was also a much higher proportion of clinical waste, and that was because staff didn't segregate the waste properly. And as a result, the cost per treatment was significantly higher, despite the fact that Coburg actually paid more for their waste disposal under a different contract. And so we worked out that if we could improve things at Royal Melbourne, we would save about $10,000 per year that then could go towards patient care. In terms of what's happening in Australia and New Zealand, we asked exactly this question a few years ago, and the answer was really not much at all. And so we approached the Australian New Zealand Society of Nephrology, which is the representative body really for nephrologists, to see whether we could convene a working group to start looking at this. We thought it was really important that we also had representation from the nursing community and also from the patient and carer community, because this really does have to be something that involves the whole renal community. So we have put together a working group, and we have representatives from all of those groups, including a consumer, a dialysis patient, Greg Collette, and he's been actually just a fantastic asset to our group. He has an entirely different skill set to us, he's got a different perspective, and he really has been the primary driver of a lot of our initiatives. In terms of what we've done, we've only really been in operation about 18 months, but the first thing we did was put together a position statement that really highlighted the problems and what we thought needed to be done, and this is available on the websites of all of the organisations involved if anyone wanted to have a look and give any feedback. We thought it was really important to focus on education and research up front. You know, we need people to be aware of the problems if they're going to try and do anything about them, and we also need evidence to guide us in achieving best practice. So we've worked to include green sort of teachings into our annual meeting. So we held a workshop at the RSA meeting earlier this year, and we've got a whole symposium dedicated to this at this meeting on Tuesday. We'll be talking about the effect of climate change on the kind of diseases we will see from a kidney perspective, and also these sort of things, what we can do to improve the way we deliver care. We've also developed environmental research prizes that get awarded to both the nursing community and the medical community for best environmental research. The other thing we're working on at the moment is a website that really we hope will act as a resource to people working in dialysis units to show them what they can do, but also for patients, particularly those at home who might want to make modifications around their house or address some of the same sort of issues. And just to finish up, I just thought I'd mention 2 specific projects that I've been involved with that I think are sort of really positive examples of what can be done. Back in 2016 at my hospital in Melbourne, we initiated a telehealth service for kidney transplant recipient follow-up. So many of you will know that particularly early post-transplant follow-up is really rigorous, and we have a very high proportion of our patients that come from regional areas. And so there's a lot of travel involved for them, or even in many cases staying away from home for a long period of time while they're needing frequent care. Also, travel contributes significantly to greenhouse gas emissions. We use a really fantastic platform that has great audio-visual capacity. It's really simple to access. You just click on a web link, or there's icons on our desktops, and then you join in the consultation. In the beginning, we were just offering it to patients early post-transplant who needed regular follow-up and didn't have anyone close to home that could provide that. But it's been such a successful program that we're now really offering it to all our patients, and it's been particularly attractive to people who want to go back to work. We now have people dialing in from work, or very often from their car, in the car park at work. We also offer the opportunity for patients to go to their GP practice and link in through their GP, and that's been really important for patients that don't feel comfortable or have access to the internet. And it's also been really great for increasing local expertise in how to manage transplant patients, because we work sort of in consultation with general practitioners or local nurses. We've had, I put this together a while ago, but at the time we'd had 45 patients that had taken up this offer. We're now closer to about 80. But with just those 45 patients, the amount of travel saved was the equivalent to going around the world 4.5 times, or sitting in a car for 109 days straight. From an environmental viewpoint, it was equivalent to planting about 1,200 seedling trees and watching them grow for 10 years. So really, really significant. But importantly, the patients have thought it was fantastic too. Not all want to engage in it, obviously. Some prefer the face-to-face contact. But those that have joined it, the feedback's been universally positive, and no one has wanted to go back to in-person reviews. We do always make people come to see us in person every couple of visits, but you know, it's a massive improvement in their kind of quality of life to not have to come so regularly. And this last trial it's a waste to resource trial, and I think this is a really exciting kind of new, just a trial that holds a lot of potential. So I talked about the fact that clinical waste is potentially infectious and currently has to be burnt or sterilised before being thrown away. Because it's potentially infectious, there's no opportunity to even think about reusing the plastic that is clinical waste, despite the fact that some of it, for instance dialysis bloodlines, are a really high quality plastic. But there are now machines that can actually sit in dialysis units and sterilise and shred up plastic waste, and what this does is create opportunity to actually reuse that plastic. So we've received some funding from Fresenius to actually purchase one of these machines, and we've been shredding up plastic and working with a group at Deakin University, a group of engineers at Deakin University who have been looking at putting little bits of this plastic into concrete and seeing what that does to the characteristics of concrete. They've tested the concrete plastic mix for strength and also for water penetrance, and what they've found in preliminary trials is that it doesn't do much at all significantly to the strength of the concrete. It stays just as strong as it was, but it's significantly more resistant to water absorption. And this is really important because water absorption leads to corrosion of concrete and is one of the major things that impacts the overall life of concrete. So the thought is that probably this concrete with dialysis plastic mixed in with it is going to be a much better product. And because of this, we've moved on to the second phase of testing. There's a lot of potential in this because firstly, it stops the environmental damage associated with burning or chemically sterilising waste. Secondly, it preserves a resource, and thirdly, if we can create something that people actually want, there's the opportunity that there's the potential that they may even buy it of us, which means we save a lot of money in the process. So just to summarise all of this, really nephrology practice is extraordinarily resource intensive, and here I'm particularly referring to dialysis. This is probably unsustainable, and I personally feel it's probably unacceptable in the face of global climate change, particularly when we have better ways that we can be doing things, and things that not only improve environmental outcomes but also have the potential to reduce the cost so we can distribute that back to patient care and actually improve efficiency and quality of care. This last slide is a quote that I particularly like, and it's from Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and he makes the point that saving our planet and lifting people out of poverty and improving health are actually all part of the same fight. It doesn't really make sense to try and fix one problem if we're contributing to another. And so I really think that it is we have the ability and it's our responsibility to see if we can find solutions to all of these problems at once. So that's all. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Katherine, that was truly inspirational, and it's a really made me think twice about how we're actually dialysing and all the waste that we're using at home. I don't know if the audience have any questions, particularly if there's any PD patients in the audience. You know, water, electricity, waste is part of our everyday struggle, and I'm sure that some of us here might have some sustainable ways that we'd like to talk about. Is there any more opinion? We've actually had someone online from Queensland again talk about sustainability options, having a look at what they do with their PD fluids and composting, and also just how they've structured their home in terms of looking at environmental ways to reduce the waste and the packaging, and creative ways of what she's done with those products. So I think that we've actually got a really huge role to play as consumers as well.
Any questions?
Hello. Actually, I don't have a question related to that, but in regards to the telehealth project that you have there, what stage of the transplantation are customers, sorry, I'm going work mode, are patients sort of able to utilise that sort of remote connection?
So we started off, so basically patients have the transplant and they need to stay, normally what we would make them do is stay in Melbourne or close so they could come in very frequently for the first month. We've now made it that patients that we think are capable of dialing in and are well enough to go home anywhere from about 2 weeks. Usually they have to come down at least once a week, but if patients are doing really well and able to manage, they can start the telehealth from about 2 weeks, and then we're extending it out to patients who are years and years from transplant.
And this is only happening in Melbourne at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, there's an increasing uptake of telehealth all over the place. I think the potential of it is really being recognised within medicine, but I'm not sure if there's any other renal units in Australia. There's only one report in the literature of the use of telehealth in kidney transplantation, and I'm not aware of other units that are doing this in any sort of formal capacity.
I can certainly add to that. In Adelaide, we routinely teleconference out to remote South Australia, but the guys in Darwin are particularly interested in this and have got more formalised clinics going throughout areas in the Northern Territory, and the guys in Western Australia as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think at first thought that was where all the real benefit was. I mean, there is obvious benefit for patients that live a long way from the centre, but what really has struck us is how much the average patient that lives close to Melbourne has really appreciated it. I mean, it's simple things like the cost of parking at the Royal Melbourne Hospital for a patient. You know, if you can save that much money 3 times a week, that's a huge benefit. A lot of the frailer patients that really struggle with, you know, the trip in and out, it's been really useful, and they can have the consultation at home with their daughter next to them. You know, if we keep them waiting, they can have a cup of coffee on the couch rather than sitting in the waiting room. So I think, you know, the potential is really huge, really obviously for patients who live in remote and regional areas, but also just generally.
I can add to that as well. In Queensland, obviously our geographical location for patients is massive. So we might be 1,000 kilometres away from our renal unit. So a lot of our patients actually are hooked up by telehealth cans and the top end of Queensland or in for a lot of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people actually hook into telehealth services through our nephrology services, and also there's a great study going on in Toowoomba, Darling Downs. The nephrologist, although his area of spread still, it was about 8 hours drive around all of the different renal units he serviced, and he's actually set up an amazing telehealth service where people that you wouldn't think would actually opt for telehealth do. So it's not just those that are working and that are able to, you know, hook up via technology. It's actually also every other kidney transplant patient who's actually just regionally located further away.
So there's a lot of opportunity in the telehealth space, I think, for our whole community to benefit.
Thank you.
Thank you.